Welcome back to Wages and Employment at Wilfrid Laurier University. Today, we are going to talk about how labor economists can contribute to our understanding and hopefully fixing various policy problems. For reference, you should pair this video with readings in chapter 1 of your textbook. I also mention here some material in a recently published paper and offer a few links to items that you can find online that I think, at least, should be worth your time to check out. Now, I think it's fair to say that the well-being of individuals is very closely tied to how well the labor market is functioning. Generally, people are not happy when they are unemployed and can't earn enough to support themselves and their families. Now, as context, I realize that most of my students will not become labor economists, but you are all voters. And I think it's important to know what you are voting for, or against for that matter. What matters to me is that our politicians effectively set the stage for how we work every day. And we want to think very carefully about what they're doing, or people could be made worse off than we'd like them to be. Now, on this slide, I've made a long list of things that you can imagine being very important for the labor market. And you can find a lot of these discussed in your textbook because they tend to be ongoing issues. There are always issues surrounding trade and immigration, taxation. They do not go away any time. And in particular, caregiving tends to be a big topic of discussion more recently. But I think that the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic offers us a really good recent example of how the work of labor economists, all the things that you're going to be learning in this course, really do matter in the real world. So in 2020, the government effectively put the economy into what we called a medically induced coma. Dr. Jennifer Robson at Carleton University was the professor who coined this term, and the media picked it up, so we continue to use it. But we called it a coma because we basically needed everything to go to sleep. Our emergency measures required businesses to close down, and we needed people to stay at home to flatten that curve, as everyone said. But it's really much harder to get people to stay at home when they know they still need to pay their bills. So workers needed to pay their bills, businesses still needed to pay the rent, the lights still got to be paid for. This wasn't something that anyone was prepared for in this type of shutdown. And so what the government did was it created a huge set of policies to try and manage things and just help everyone survive, quite literally. We had emergency response benefits going out to people who lost their jobs or were unable to work. We had some subsidies going out to businesses, in particular the wage subsidy was quite important. And then of course we had the CESB and the volunteer grants that were being made available to students. Now, this wasn't an easy thing to put together very, very quickly. I've had the privilege of being involved in the background of many policy conversations for many years now, and normally the type of support that was introduced in a matter of weeks when this first started would have taken years to build. People would have studied it for a while. They would have thought about it for a while. They would have, done all sorts of things before even introducing some of these ideas. Now, in this particular case, I got to be involved in several of the policy discussions very early on. And I highlight the article here for two reasons. The main reason is that the authors of this article brought together a really nice history of how everything moved in those first few weeks of policy development. I also highlighted here because I was among the people who got brought into these very informal conversations in the background, for instance, sitting down with the Prime Minister to take stock of what was going on and try to raise any concerns about where policy was doing well or not. Now, I recommend reading this oral article because it gets at how difficult all of those things were to get together very quickly. But why would, the Prime Minister want to talk to a bunch of labor economists just to hear what we have to say? Well, first and foremost, we were tracking what was going on in the labor market, both before the crisis and during the crisis every month as the numbers were coming out. So in this paper that we published in Canadian Public Policy, we simply picked apart who lost their jobs during the pandemic, and we could see that it was mostly people with the lowest earnings. So for this figure, we divided our February 2020 workforce into 4 groups according to how much they were earning at the time, from lowest earners to the highest earners. And we mapped out who lost jobs. So of all the jobs that were lost between February and April, 44% of those were attributed to those people who had the lowest 25% of earnings, that bottom quartile that we showed there. That largely related to the types of businesses that had to shut down, such as restaurants and bars. But it was also the fact that it was less experienced people that are often laid off first. So that tended to be younger people who were losing their jobs there. Many other things came out of that paper as well. But knowing things like this helps policymakers focus their efforts on those parts of the labor market that need the help the most, so that we can minimize how much we have to spend to try and help people along in this kind of crisis. Now, knowing who we have to target can also help us think about what is needed in terms of policy. So here in this paper, we pointed out that in the initial recovery period, when businesses could start reopening again, a lot of moms weren't making their way back to work. And basically, it was a problem that childcare was generally closed, all of the summer day camps were limited, the schools weren't open just before that, and no one was sure what was going to happen with September classes. So moms faced a lot of uncertainty and also some extra constraints that were simply preventing them from getting back to work. So here, the policy priority was really about how to maintain and build daycare spaces and try to make sure that kids were going to get back to school in September. Now, many economists had been talking about this very early on. Here's just one example if you're interested. This was my testimony before the House of Commons Standing Committee, where I emphasized the importance of caregiving, especially for children and for the elderly, and how we need a good infrastructure in place to offer that kind of caregiving if we want to have a well-functioning labor market. Now, you'll soon notice that we have an entire chapter dedicated to the design of income support programs and other related policies. This is going to be discussed throughout the course. We tried to help think about how to design income support in both the short and the long term. And given the unpredictable nature of the pandemic, that was incredibly challenging. What will become clear to you, I think, as we move forward in the course, is that what you want to offer people for a short-term problem might be very, very different than you want to offer as a permanent policy solution going forward for offering a social safety net. So these were difficult things to put together, and I think if you were paying attention to the media over the summer, you would have seen a bit of just how challenging that can be, both in terms of policy design and also politics. So why do we talk to labor economists? One of the main reasons to talk to labor economists right away is that we're always studying what happens during recessions. And usually after a recession happens, people go back, dig through the data and see how things worked out for everyone. There's been a few studies that look at what happens to students. So Phil Oriopoulos, he has a paper with some co-authors looking at what happens when students graduate during a recession in terms of their income. And he shows that people starting out basically don't get that best first job and takes a really long time to recover, in the sense that you're going to have to work your way through or up a ladder in order to get to what would have been your best first job, and it's going to take many, many years. And so people have long-term, lifetime earnings losses if they were to graduate during a recession and go right into the labor force. Another paper here by Matthias, he takes a look at what happens when people enter college during a recession. People often do this. When wages aren't looking very good, might as well go back to school. Well, when people do that, they tend to come out at the other end when they graduate earning higher wages than they would have otherwise. And so there's a lot of benefits to thinking about going to school during a recession rather than coming out and then trying to join the labor market. Now, overall, the frameworks that we will develop in this course have proven quite useful for understanding the decisions that people make and how to best design policy. And I think you'll find being able to analyze data is also a very practical skill to have later on when you are trying to build your career. So with what we have seen so far, and I think what you'll see over the next few months, I hope that you find some very practical information and skills in terms of thinking about what is going on in the world around us. Now, in our next video, we're going to be introducing our chapter on labor supply. We'll see you then.